Yeah. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and start here. So if you just joined or whatever, please mute yourself just for this part, and then when we get to the discussion point part, then we can start unmuting. Like I said, the purpose of this is just a discussion. For the first part of the meeting, what I'm going to do is just kind of give you an overview of just generally what a special assessment district is for any folks who weren't able to be at the October meeting, which I'll talk about the process for the the potential Ore Lake SAD that's in process, where we are at this point. And then I will stop the recording. I'll share some points that have been brought up in the past few months about concerns and questions related to it. And then at that point, I'm going to stop talking and we're going to open it up for discussion for folks. And depending on how many people we have, once I get to that point, we'll see. We may break out into breakout rooms, or we'll just have the whole group discussion, but we'll talk about it when we get to that point. So kind of going into this, before getting into the overview of the SAD, I just want to, one thing that can be a little bit confusing with all of this is who's involved in what part of this and all those things. So I just wanted to kind of give you some guidance here as to the two, in a sense, two groups that are not really organizations, committee and organization, that have been working sort of in parallel, but not really related to some of this. So one group is the Hamburg Township Flood Prevention Committee, and so I listed the folks here that are on that committee. That's a list of, basically it's a volunteer group who wants to work closely with the township in relation to the river cleanup. The SAD, or Special Assessment District, has been part of that conversation. So that committee has been the primary group of people that have been in lots of close conversations with the township about it, in the process of moving it forward and so on. So as you can see in the bottom, it says that committee is, in a sense, is a decision-making body. However, decision-making is a little bit fuzzy in this sense that a special assessment district is actually a community or a resident-initiated process, and so anyone can actually go through that process. It doesn't have to be a specific committee or anything, but this is the group of people that has initiated it and worked through that process with the township. Another group of people that have been involved in lots of conversations related to this, you'll see some overlaps with some of the folks here, is the advisory board for our organization, the Huron River Watershed. I'm sorry, oh my gosh, wrong group, sorry. Residents Working Against Huron River Flooding, our advisory board. We've had some conversations around it. There's folks that are in both the advisory board and the flood prevention committee, and also just general membership across our organization around the lake. As you can see, our organization has really no say in any moving forward or not with relation to the process for the SAD, but with some people in both roles, there's been kind of different conversations in different spaces. So today the chance is to actually bring those conversations together so everyone can kind of talk together, share ideas, and then really, again, just open it up for conversation and discussion. Okay, so just kind of an overview about what a special assessment district is, or referred to as a SAD. So this is what basically becomes, if passed, it's an assessment on property owners to make certain improvements as requested by those owners, and to levy assessments on the owner's property. So in particular, the SAD, it's requested by property owners, it's drafted by the township, and then the residents actually are the ones who pay into that. So you get assessed once a year on your winter taxes for whatever the amount is for the SAD. It's a 10-year time span. That's what it sits for. So for those who can sign the SAD, that's the deeded owners of the property as approved for, or as approved for trust. Deeded owners for the property as designated in whatever the boundary is for the SAD itself, which we'll talk about in a moment here for the specific one. For actually having it pass, we need more than 50% of the total land area acreage of parcels that needs to vote yes for the SAD for it to actually pass. Now notice here, there's two different things. So there's for the SAD to actually pass and get approved by community owners or property owners, it's 50% of the total land area. Okay, so if someone has a very large piece of property, so those of us on Ore Lake, many of us know that on the north side of Ore Lake, there's a very large piece of property there. That person has a much more weighted vote, in a sense, in the SAD, because they have a larger property area. That's for the voting part of it. However, if it's approved and passed, the assessment is just applied per parcel, not per land acreage. So that's a slight difference between the voting and the actual assessment on the properties. And then in this process, so basically what will happen is, should it move forward, people will go around door to door, they'll send out with the petitions, they'll get signatures. And if you sign it saying you agree to move forward with the SAD, you do actually have a chance to rescind your vote should you want to, and you have that chance until the close of the first public hearing to remove your vote. And so that can be either by sending a letter to the township by the date of that hearing requesting to have your signature removed, or appearing at the hearing and requesting to have your name removed before the close of that meeting. Okay, so there are options. Even if you do sign it, you can rescind and take back your signature should you want to, but there is a deadline on that. So with that, let me go into the kind of the process that's been going on with the Ore Lake SAD that's been under development. So you can kind of see where we are in that process. And then I'll talk a little bit about, in a sense, the next steps with this, should it end up moving forward. And then I think at that point we'll stop and I'll talk about some concerns and then we'll have a discussion. So this was brought up as an option last summer. It was suggested to us that we could put in place a special assessment district, and that with the purposes of trying to help mitigate flooding. And so there's lots of different options of what that could look like. So when that was brought up as an option, the Flood Prevention Committee met multiple times in the fall to discuss those options, to discuss boundaries for the SAD, and what that might look like. A lot of those conversations, actually I think almost all those conversations, happen at the township, in conversation with Pat Hull, the township supervisor, and some other folks at the township helping us make sense of kind of what's going on and what options we have and so on, because of course they are writing it up in a legal sense. We are just supplying suggestions as to what that might look like. That was just throughout the fall. And then kind of with that, with lots of questions going on, I had asked Pat Hull to have a community meeting to discuss the SAD. So in October of 2024, he led an in-person meeting at the library discussing, and I think we had over 50 people, which was great. He came and talked about the process, what it looked like, other lakes and how that happens, how the SAD has happened in other lakes, and kind of what it would look like for us. So some of the things that he talked about, so you know, is that Hamburg Township only covers, I guess, over 3/4 of our lake. So there are some homeowners that are on Riverside Drive that are in Green Oak Township. So the only way for this SAD to actually move forward is it has to pass both at Hamburg Township and Green Oak. So the language that's drafted, which I'll show you in a moment, that language is being shared with Green Oak Township, and they have the exact same SAD. And that would be distributed to the homeowners on Riverside that are in Green Oak Township. And it has to pass with that 50% land acreage there, as well as the 50% land acreage on the Hamburg Township side of the lake for the actual SAD to be approved and move forward. Okay, so that's kind of one situation there. So that's one of the things that he talked about. So that's something to keep in mind, that yes, we talk about it in the Hamburg Township space, but there's actually the exact same SAD happening in Green Oak Township, with the intention in both cases to try and help mitigate some flooding. So then in the fall, after that October meeting, the Flood Prevention Committee had more conversations about what work we actually wanted to be included in the SAD, which I'll show you in a moment what that was decided to be. And what that language looks like. The focus is primarily on weed harvesting in the river, with some weed removal in Ore Lake, and also opening up the potential of removal of weeds via other methods such as herbicides or whatever that might be, but that's all dependent on Eagle's approval, which at the moment isn't something we can do anyway, but it's all written into it, and I'll show you in a moment what that language looks like. So those are all the conversations there. And then in February of 2026, the Flood Prevention Committee and Hamburg Township met to discuss the boundaries specifically of the SAD, now that they identified what was going to be included in it. At those conversations, the boundaries, for lots of different reasons, were decided to be only those properties that have that are directly on Ore Lake and Little Ore Lake. One of the challenges, there was lots of conversations about whether or not to include the folks who have just deeded access to Ore Lake, that sit behind Ore Lake. And one of the challenges with including the folks who have deeded access is that it's going to take the township a lot longer to identify all those people, which would set back the process for the SAD by an entire year, if we wanted to include the folks with deeded access. So that's something to keep in mind. Also with that, there were lots of conversations about whether or not to include the folks on the river, which brought up questions about how far down the river and so on. So because of of all those reasons, at that time in February of this year, the Flood Prevention Committee, in conversation with Hamburg Township, had decided to focus this round of the SAD specifically on the folks who live on Ore Lake and Little Ore Lake. So then in March of 2025, Hamburg Township shared the drafted language with the Flood Prevention Committee. There was lots of conversations and questions back and forth via email about that. The language is finalized, which again, I'll show you in just a moment. Later in March, actually right after that language was kind of drafted, at that point, some other concerns, now that we had the language, were brought up to our advisory board for residents working against Huron River flooding, which again, there's a lot of folks who are in both roles, the Flood Prevention Committee and the advisory board. Because the concerns were brought to the advisory board had met and discussed those concerns, recognized the challenges that were raised, which I'll talk about in a moment, and then just gave a recommendation to the Flood Prevention Committee that the distribution of the SAD be paused for a year, with the hope of actually some community-funded weed harvesting this year to see about the effects, which I'll talk about in a second. Again, this is all based on a recommendation from the advisory board to the Flood Prevention Committee. And I'll talk about all those in a moment. And then at this point, we're in the April 2025 where we're having our discussion. So before I get into the details of all those concerns and everything, I did want to share the language with you of what the SAD petition language actually looks like. And so this is one of those moments where I will tell you, as someone who presents a lot, I find it really annoying when someone reads a slide, but because there's a lot of text here, I do want you to actually hear the language. And so I am actually going to read it out loud. There's 3 slides that you're going to hear me read, but this is the full SAD language that you're going to hear. Before I start reading, I do want to just point out the purpose of this community meeting is not to wordsmith what's going on. We can certainly talk about questions or concerns or ideas related to what's included in the SAD, but I don't want to spend any time like wordsmithing this word versus this word and so on, just for time's sake and giving people a chance to actually converse about it, which when we open up for full discussion. So here we go. So the language of the SAD says, we, the undersigned, being or representing the record owners of more than 50% of the total land area within a proposed special assessment district, being lands abutting Ore Lake, Little Ore Lake, and those properties having access along the Huron River, more commonly referred to as the Ore Lake and Huron River Area Aquatic Weed Treatment SAD, hereby respectfully petition the Hamburg Township Board to create a special assessment district for the purposes of weed control as described below, referred to as the project, under authority of the Township Public Improvements Act, number 188, Public Acts of Michigan, 1954, as amended, for the Ore Lake and Huron River Area Aquatic Weed Treatment SAD. The project shall be paid for through special assessments levied on those properties located within the district for a period of 10 years. The method of assessment for aquatic weed control shall be levied on a per parcel basis. Then it goes on to talk about the project description. So that says, the project consists of establishing an aquatic weed control special assessment district to benefit those properties abutting Ore Lake, Little Ore Lake, and those properties along the Huron River. Aquatic weed control shall consist of the following services: weed and algae treatment and/or removal by chemical or mechanical means to effectuate drainage from Ore Lake as approved by the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, or its EGLE, or its successors, and mechanical harvesting of aquatic weeds on Ore Lake, Little Ore Lake, and/or the Huron River area shall be completed multiple times annually if practicable and as recommended by the project limnologist. And contractor must comply with all EGLE requirements and shall be required to obtain all necessary permits, and contractor shall be responsible for disposal of all spoils resulting from weed and/or algae treatment as approved by EGLE. So those are the project description of what's included in the special assessment, what it will be, the funds will be used for. And then the last 2 paragraphs of the SAD petition language, it talks this is language that the township said is automatically just included in SAD based on legal requirements. So it says, we, the petitioners, understand and agree to be responsible for the payment of any and all legal fees for any litigation arising from the preparation, implementation, and/or administration of the requested special assessment district, SAD. We, the petitioners, further understand that the project shall be conducted in accordance with plans for the same to be prepared, reviewed, and/or approved by the Township Board, and that the costs thereof, including expenses connected with engineering, planning, and legal costs, will be assessed against each parcel of land within said proposed district, whether or not the project is completed. In the event that the special assessment district is not created, the undersigned agree to reimburse the township for all such costs, and that the township may assess our property for any such repayment. So before I move into the next part, talking about concerns and stuff, I do just want to outline that's all the language of the SAD. The next steps, should this end up moving forward, is that, like I said, people will take this language around as a petition, take it to all the homeowners that that are directly abutting Ore Lake and Little Ore Lake, get signatures as required. If we get 50% of those signatures for both Hamburg Township SAD and the Green Oak Township SAD, they move forward to the actual board of directors for each township. The board of directors needs to approve the SAD, and then it goes into effect there. And then just so you know, the way the SAD is actually implemented, should it all be approved, is that to determine, for example, when they would harvest weeds, the township works with a limnologist. This is something they've been doing with other aquatic weed control SADs, like the Chain of Lakes one. They work with the limnologist. The limnologist maps out where the weeds are, in that case in the lake, in this case the river, and identifies where it would make the most sense to actually harvest the weeds. It is up to the township to make the decision to harvest the weeds. That said, the township has told us on the flood prevention committee that the limnologist would share that information with the flood prevention committee, and they would have the flood prevention committee would give recommendations to the township as to when to do that. But again, that's all in conversation. So that's what we've been told at this point. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop recording, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about, if I can find my Zoom here. I'm going to talk a little bit about, like I said, the questions and concerns that have been brought up.